Ukraine's foreign minister is all set to visit India. Now, there is certainly a backdrop to it. Why exactly would you have the same very foreign minister who had taken a very strong position about India suddenly visiting New Delhi? First, let's begin by what's expected and why exactly is the foreign minister here in India, and what role could India really play? Will India actually play the mediator's role? But the fact of the matter is this, that somewhere down the line, both the leaders, President Zelensky and President Putin, will have to realize that there has to be a midway. You can't possibly go with what the Russians initially thought, that in 4 days, Ukraine is going to be completely over. There is a resistance.
But before that, I want to know from you, you were there on the ground, how bad is the situation? Someone told me that, forget about everything else, the kind of human disaster that's happened there, if the war stops now, it will take 10 or 15 years for the Ukrainians to come out of the psychological impact of the war.
We are talking about the entire eastern side, which is obviously closer to the Russians, which is completely devastated. Then you go down, which is closer to the Odessa, which is the port area, which again you've lost out large part of it despite the grain deal, etc. not taking place. That was the main source of their economy. That has been completely collapsed. So where do you really get the money from? So this is right now a country which is only surviving largely on the aid that has been given by the other country. So I think so today they've realized, earlier they were not taking us that seriously. They were not perhaps hoping that, they had reached a situation they thought that India is not going to be on their side. But look at what India has essentially done. On the humanitarian ground, 15 consignments have gone in. On the fact that perhaps Prime Minister is one of the few world leaders, or the only leader who's largely spoken about the dialogue aspect, and that's what they are heading towards.
I think India has played an important role in terms of Prime Minister Modi publicly sort of counseling President Putin, and only he could do it with his stature, that this is not an era of wars. But insofar as mediation is concerned, I would say Ukraine, with the kind of complete lackey it has become of the West, it's difficult to believe that Ukraine would listen to India. It's so unfortunate that the West thinks that this war is a bloody James Bond movie. If you remember James Bond movies, most of them have a Russian villain or a Chinese villain, and it's almost like as if Hollywood is sort of scripting this for the West leadership. It's unfortunate. Imagine the strategic blunder of the West by doing what they have done in this Europe war. They have almost effectively and permanently put Russia in the lap of China.
Hello and welcome. This is a special episode on what's really happening in Russia and Ukraine war. Now, since the war began in 2022, this is for the first time that Ukraine's foreign minister is all set to visit India. Now, there is certainly a backdrop to it. Why exactly would you have the same very foreign minister who had taken a very strong position about India suddenly visiting New Delhi? Now, the backdrop essentially is a possible peace summit to take place this summer. And that's where our conversation is going to be around today, because the question here is that whether India plays a pivotal role, and where Russia has already declared, Abhishek, that any peace summit without the presence of Russia is going to be a complete disaster. And Ukraine on the other side, it's a non-starter, because given the fact that you already have a law in Ukraine that there perhaps cannot be any discussion, dialogue with Russia under Putin. That's the position that they've taken, perhaps the biggest impediment. First, let's begin by what's expected and why exactly is the foreign minister here in India, and what role could India really play? Will India actually play the mediator's role?
So as I see it, Shawan, he could be here because maybe he wants to invite India, and India is an important country. We have seen India's stature grow over the last few years. India's importance take a certain proportion in the Committee of Nations, and our voice is heard. Between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, the manner in which they have articulated not just India's self-interest, but dovetailed it with what is in the larger interest of the world. And that's why our position as a Vishwamitra. So I think in that sense, maybe of course he would want to, the Ukrainians would want to engage, but as you mentioned, very rightly so, that if the Ukrainians want a peace summit without talking to Russia, it's not just an impediment, but I would add to what you said, it's a non-starter. I mean, you talk peace with the person or the nation with which you are in a fight. I mean, what's the point of Ukraine talking peace with Mauritius?
Correct.
Right? What's the point of talking peace with NATO? NATO is supplying weapons, right? So obviously this seems more like, I mean, I don't know the details as yet, but it seems more like shoring up resources for Ukraine, if nothing else. In the name of peace, they actually want more war.
Well, in fact, just to add to this, the situation is like this, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of what's really happening currently in Ukraine. Ukraine certainly finds itself in a dichotomy right now, with the US Congress essentially blocking that package in terms of military aid not really coming in, US heading towards an election. So the big question here is that every time when the West really comes into the picture, therein lies a big problem, if I may say so. From the two experiences that I personally had while covering Ukraine as well as while covering Afghanistan, I see the moment West enters begins the real problem, because somewhere down the line their promises are never fulfilled. And two examples, of course Afghanistan being one, Vietnam being the other. I personally believe, Abhishek, that somewhere down the line Ukraine was over dependent on what the West wanted it to do, not realizing that Russia is after all their neighbor. You like it, you don't like it, you will have to accept it. But at the same time, I'll also ask you this. The Russian president's recent interview that he had given, in which once again he went into this history of what he believes is that one Russia, which includes Ukraine. Now that history has been interpreted from the Russian perspective, which the Ukrainians are simply saying that, look here, all that I'm asking for are two words: freedom, independence. Do you think when Russia says that there is going to be a summit, peace summit, it's not going to be successful, they themselves are not willing to be a part of any sort of summit, or not willing to engage with the Ukrainians? So how exactly are they taking the moral high ground?
I tell you why they are taking, or how they are taking, or how President Putin, because he is the word or he is the law when it comes to Russia, why he is taking moral high ground, and why there is, irrespective of what perception we get consuming Western media, what Putin says carries the weight of general mass sentiment also. Because remember, at the end of it, what is the language people in Ukraine speak? You have been to Ukraine, they speak Russian, right? They don't speak French, they don't speak German. Like it happens in Europe, most of the nations are language centric nations, right? If the Ukrainians speak Russian, obviously they ideally should have more affinity towards Russia. But then over a period of time, because of the exigencies of the Cold War and the manner in which the world has really panned out post Cold War also, they have ended up shifting slowly and slowly towards the West, of course orchestrated by the West. So Putin, for example, has a point that if the Cold War has ended, why not stop expanding NATO?
Right.
Why do you need to expand NATO when the purpose of NATO itself in terms of taking on USSR is over, right? Under Putin, Russia is not a communist state like China is. I mean, there are some remnants of the communist structure, but it's essentially a capitalist society. Remember, the moment McDonald's announced that they are going out, the Russians got in their own equivalent of McDonald's, right? Similarly in the case of Coke. So I think the West makes a mistake of continuing to see an evil or devil in Russia, and that is the reason, that is the root cause. Because if the natural affinity of Ukraine is towards Russia, I fail to understand why they should be so dead against engaging with Russia and move towards NATO. I mean, that's a non-starter, I would say, for peace talks. Ukraine joining NATO, President Putin has said. In fact, go back to 2008, you said they don't want to engage. 2008, President Putin said, I am willing to join NATO, right? Make me part of NATO, make me part of yourself. Minsk agreements, I think Russia was being reasonable, they were talking. It's only when by and by you see that the West continued to renege and continued to see, most importantly, evil or devil in Russia or President Putin, that it's become an ego clash. It's ironic that West, particularly Europe, continues to make the mistakes that they made in World War I, they made the mistakes in World War II, and unfortunately they continue in this century also.
Just a bit of a historical referencing here. This is exactly what the Russians keep saying, that look here, it was because of the affinity towards NATO is where we felt that we need to defend ourselves. That's what the Russians have said. But look at what happened. 2014, the annexation of Crimea. Before that, you wouldn't have really heard the Ukrainians essentially saying that I want freedom and independence, or I want to be closer to the NATO. They are simply saying that today if there is a need for security, because I alone can't guarantee my security, I need other nations to come into the picture, and this wouldn't have happened if the annexation of Crimea wouldn't have taken place. So many would say that somewhere down the line, if Russia wants to drum up or shore up that kind of confidence among the public, amongst the masses, they wanted to go back to that, what we would have said Akhand Bharat kind of a referencing.
It is.
It's an Akhand Russia kind of referencing. But the fact of the matter is this, that somewhere down the line both the leaders, President Zelensky and President Putin, will have to realize that there has to be a midway. You can't possibly go with what the Russians initially thought, that in 4 days Ukraine is going to be completely over. There is a resistance, and as far as answering your question, what is it, the language that they speak, that Ukrainians would say, we speak Ukrainian, and more importantly there is a section, the eastern part, which has more affinity towards the Russians and perhaps not the other side. But the reality is this, the Ukrainians will also have to realize that they are perhaps in a quagmire right now. They do not know which way to really go if the West does not really support the way they were expecting. Things would change if Trump becomes the president. So where do they really stand today?
So I'll answer, but before that I want to know from you, you were there on the ground, how bad is the situation? Someone told me that forget about everything else, the kind of human disaster that's happened there, if the war stops now, it will take 10 or 15 years for the Ukrainians to come out of the psychological impact of the war. The human loss that has happened, somebody has lost their brother, somebody has lost their sister, somebody has lost their father, mother. I mean, the relationships are absolutely gone. Every family has suffered a loss, human loss, and the psychological scars of the war are going to take a decade or more to come out. Like, you were there on the ground, please tell me what's that.
I would say you'll be astonished. You will be astonished to learn the fact that in terms of numbers, do we really know the numbers, the number of people who've lost their lives in Ukraine? Not really.
Maybe
because there are two reasons for it. One, in terms of really keeping a check on the numbers itself has been a tough task for the Ukrainian authority even when the war actually began. So this is the question that we had also asked, that how many soldiers have they lost? The count is something that you would not know. Ask this question to the Russians also, will they be able to tell you, or will they ever tell you how many Russian soldiers have they lost? They're not going to. Somewhere down the line, both the countries have been guarding this entire thing about the loss that they have essentially faced, but that was for quite some time. Ukrainians perhaps will also now want to put this out in a while from now, because remember, the rebuilding that nation is going to be a real tough task. Because just a quick picture, we are talking about the entire eastern side, which is obviously closer to the Russians, which is completely devastated. Then you go down, which is closer to the Odessa, which is the port area, which again you've lost out large part of it despite the grain deal, etc. not taking place. That was the main source of their economy. That has been completely collapsed. So where do you really get the money from? So this is right now a country which is only surviving largely on the aid that has been given by the other countries. That too, there are changing situations. Poland, the current political situation is changing. Hungary had already changed. So they are also looking at a situation where they are surrounded by, to a certain extent, a hostile situation, especially coming in from Hungary, if not really from Poland, given the fact that Poland did play an important role. But yes, I personally feel that if today the same very foreign minister who had taken a very strong position about India buying Russian oil, his last statement when I heard on the day of Holi, he invoked Mahatma Gandhi. He said that two things is what we are looking forward.
That's
freedom
a mischief,
and
actually.
Independence is what we are looking at. We are hoping that India is going to come into the picture. Just a quick point before hand it back to you. The conversation that we had with the president, because we were one of the few Indian, perhaps we were the only Indian channel, we had the opportunity of asking the president 1 month into the war, and we asked him a specific question as to what is the expectation does he have from India in particular, and South Asia in general, keeping in mind the role of China too. President at that point in time had already indicated and hope that India is going to play a different role altogether in terms of a mediator's role is what they are really looking forward to. So I think so today they've realized, earlier they were not taking us that seriously. They were not perhaps hoping that, you know, they had reached a situation they thought that India is not going to be on their side, but look at what India has essentially done. On the humanitarian ground, 15 consignments have gone in, on the fact that perhaps Prime Minister is one of the few world leaders or the only leader who's largely spoken about the dialogue aspect, and that's what they are heading towards.
Yeah. So, okay, let me begin with the Foreign Minister Kuleba speaking from in front of Mahatma Gandhi's statue while announcing India visit. I thought there was a mischief because he was sort of trying to suggest that maybe India needs to take a little more moralistic position. But he does not decide what position we take or what moralistic position we take. So, that was one. Second, going back to the Crimea issue that you mentioned, that had it not been for that, the positions would not have hardened. But look at this, 1991 the Cold War ended, NATO was 17 or 18 nations, today it's 33 or 34 nations, and all through this period NATO has been expanding east. So in a way, that slow creep, with that slow creep we have been sort of sending a message to Russia that we continue to remain hostile. When Putin says let me join NATO, you say no, and you continue to move towards east in a manner that Russia feels threatened. So obviously they have to do something, number one. Number two, you mentioned Ukrainians speak Ukrainian, which is a dialect of Russian, but definitely not a dialect of French, right? It's not a dialect of German, it's a dialect of Russian. And towards the east, the Donbas republics, which are effectively now in control of Russia, you speak Russian. But more importantly, on July 7, 2021, President Putin, a year before the special military operation was launched, President Putin wrote a long rationale of what you call Akhand Russia, and he said Kiev happens to be the mother of all Russian cities. The Russian culture sort of took roots there, right? It's like the kind of nostalgia we feel thinking of the area in Swat Valley in occupied Kashmir.
Ukrainians will tell you that since it's that concept of Kiev Rus, they say that Moscow, or for that matter Russia, has been born out of Ukraine, because if you really look at the Kiev Rus history,
so then Ukraine should say let Russia become part of Ukraine. Then Ukraine should not be saying let's become part of Germany, right? So that's the problem. Yeah. Coming back, you see, the Moscovites, the Russians, maybe they feel that same nostalgia for Kiev that we feel, for example, for that Swat Valley in Pak occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
Right.
The Rig Ved was written there. The culture has genesis there, right? So obviously the connect is there. Because of the politics, because of the machinations of the West, you are in a situation where you have a leader who does not want to acknowledge that historical fact, and that is the root cause of the problem. And then you are supplying weapons. So as the joke goes, the West would fight the Russia war to the last Ukrainian.
Right.
And that's what I was asking you. What is the human cost and who's paying it? Moscow, the theatres are running. Of course, there has been a tragedy, but malls are running. You saw that very famous interview of President Putin, and before that, when this US journalist Tucker Carlson, when he went to Moscow, and the manner he went around Moscow and said it's better than New York. So obviously, who's paying the human cost? The Ukrainians, unfortunately, and the West is just financing it. So obviously, better sense has to prevail. As I said, from World War I to World War II to now, I mean, do you see mind being given precedence to heart? No. Because mind should be saying that, see, this is wrong. You have to sit across the table and let the two parties talk. You are not letting. And finally, you said about the mediation part of India. I think India has played an important role in terms of Prime Minister Modi publicly sort of counseling President Putin, and only he could do it with his stature, that this is not an era of wars. But insofar as mediation is concerned, I would say Ukraine, with the kind of complete lackey it has become of the West, it's difficult to believe that Ukraine would listen to India. If they did, it would be in the interest of peace. But I would say, if at all, it is going to be a triangulation. So at some places, at some point in time, maybe Turkey can be better help. like they did in the case of grain deal, effectively Turkey brokered it, or at some places maybe China can handle it better. It's so unfortunate that the West thinks that this war is a bloody James Bond movie. If you remember James Bond movies, most of them have a Russian villain or a Chinese villain, and it's almost like as if Hollywood is sort of scripting this for the West leadership. It's unfortunate. You see, you have to let these two leaders or these leaderships to talk. That's the best way forward. What have you done? Imagine the strategic blunder of the West by doing what they have done in this Europe war. They have almost effectively and permanently put Russia in the lap of China. Has this served the strategic objectives of West? It has not. This dragon bear, as it is called. Russia is the smaller power. You could have just engaged with them. Now you have to deal with China plus Russia plus all the things they can create together.
But is there a lesson for us also? Because see, what is it that they are arguing? They are arguing that our territorial integrity, our territorial sovereignty has been completely, perhaps been ruined. But the fact that you have Russia with a greater military power being able to
how is territorial integrity of NATO or West compromised
that
if Finland becomes remember in World War II Sweden was neutral, and now it has become member of NATO when there is no war coming in their doorsteps.
The argument is that if I can't save myself from a military power like Russia, so I need someone else to help me. Ukraine is saying that
but Russia is not saying that they are going to war with Sweden. Nobody wants to disturb the Swedes. It's obviously politics. That's what I'm saying. Sweden did not feel like joining the war during World War II. Sweden was not threatened by anyone in World War II.
So you think there is a more of a
Germany is closer to Sweden than Russia, and they speak same Germanic languages. Yet Sweden remained neutral in World War II, and now they are joining NATO. So obviously this is all politics and very short-sighted, myopic politics, which is not helping the world.
So would you not agree this entire thing, this of being belligerent about your positioning, about the fact that if the Russians also do not agree to have any word with the Ukrainian side, it is not going to end, and the longer it goes, it is just going to go out of hand. So somewhere down the line,
look, the Crimea thing started with the change of government that was orchestrated by the West in Ukraine, right? Maybe another change of government can change things and Russia can talk. I don't think Putin at any stage has shown any aversion to talking, but he can't talk to Zelensky. Or even if he can, there has to be back channel in a manner that the provocations stop. The provocations are simply not stopping, unfortunately. And a greater part of responsibility of provocations rests with West.
But there is also a fixation. The current,
it's a James Bond fixation, nothing else.
The fixation,
James Bond fixation. Russia is evil. Russia is devil. I mean,
now it's a bit bizarre here. Only part is that the attack that took place in Moscow, the blame was that Ukrainians, they were
so obviously Russians are paying back. Unfortunate. It's Islamic State. All imprint is there. It's Islamic State. But the Russians also want to continue to sort of use this as a stick to browbeat Ukraine, because they understand, and everyone understands who's looking at war, that Ukraine is the weaker party. So I think it's sad. It's sad, and Ukraine does not have the resources anymore to fight this war. For almost like, if not a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis, they have to go out and beg from some country or the other to get some resources to sustain the war. Russia understands that. Remember, in World War II, even historically, if you look at it, Russians can sustain wars for years together. They have it in their DNA, right? What they did in World War II, they just withdrew. Let the Germans come. How far would they come? And they froze. And then in winters, they came back. And it's going on from Napoleon's time. Russians have it in their DNA to wear out a war. And so I would say, if this peace summit has to really attain its objectives, provocations have to stop. The West has to let the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian leadership talk. West has to understand that no strategic objective is served, for God's sake, by putting Russia in the lap of China. And West has to understand that a peaceful Europe and a peaceful world community with all the supply disruptions restored is the way to go.
Well, what I also found very interesting was China's 12-point peace proposal that has been rejected by the West. So somewhere down the line, China too wants to play a very important role in this, but remains to be seen whether 2024 actually is going to be that year when finally this war comes to an end, because at the end of the day, we're talking about a massive human cost, and not just that, it has its ramifications across the globe.